Hi everybody, so continuing on with our second lecture on abortion, we just talked about who gets them and why. And so now we're going to wade a little bit into the controversy of the kind of the pro-life and the pro-choice arguments as they're often described. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but there might be a few perspectives that you haven't considered before, so I figure it's worth spending a few moments. So first of all, when we look at the public opinion about Roe versus Wade, which as you remember was the 1973 Supreme Court decision that protected a woman's right to obtain an abortion, the vast majority of Americans, so 64%, say that that should be left in place. 28% think it should be overturned, and 9% don't really have an opinion either way. This changes a little bit from time to time over the years, but has been fairly consistent that the majority of Americans feel that there should be some right to abortion, at least until some point in time in the pregnancy. So I think that's important to point out because a lot of times we hear more from the folks who feel that abortion should be illegal. They are the folks that tend to buy bulletin boards, or excuse me, not bulletin boards, billboards. And so we see a lot of that messaging, but it's not the majority opinion currently in our country. But the argument that abortion should be illegal is actually pretty straightforward. Right? The argument is that a fetus is a person and that ending that pregnancy is equivalent to murder. So that is pretty straightforward. And as we've talked about, and so the Catholic Church's position for a long time has been that this is a grave sin, right? So this quote from Pope John Paul II, a nation that kills its own children is a nation without hope, right? So this idea that it is murder, which if you believe a fetus is a person, then yes, it would be. And so this is another interesting quote, which I think speaks to a little bit about how we think about policy making and how to address this as a society, right? And so she says the answer to a crisis pregnancy is to eliminate the crisis, not the pregnancy, right? So in her worldview, that is a child, but that is not true for all Americans, right? We don't all share that same religious or philosophic belief that that a fetus is an actual person or a child. So in terms of the arguments that abortion should be legal, there are kind of several different takes on that. Many people point out that if you're pro-life, then you need to support life in all of its many forms and not just focus on the unborn. So Sister Joan Chitzesser has actually made quite a name for herself by working to make people appreciate that you have to support life after the child is born as well, right? So she says, I think in many cases your morality is deeply lacking if all you want is a child born, but not a child fed, not a child educated, not a child housed. That's not pro-life, that's pro-birth. And so a lot of people have kind of picked up on this, right? That if we're going to be worried about the unborn, we need to be just as concerned and just as thoughtful in our policies in caring for those children who have been born. This is a cartoon that kind of illustrates that same idea that perhaps sometimes some of our policymakers care more about the rights of the unborn than the health and the well-being of the people who are here already. People also point out some of the hypocrisy of the violence that is often perpetuated by anti-abortion activists. In fact, many abortion providers have been killed, have been murdered, actually, by anti-abortion activists. And certainly, I can understand that people may justify that killing one person is worth it if it saves hundreds of fetuses from potentially dying. But it's a little bit flawed then, because if murder is a sin, then murder is a sin, right? So people talk about this hypocrisy. And unfortunately, threats of violence have been on the rise recently as some more national rhetoric around the anti-abortion movement has kind of gained popularity, I suppose, among some of our elected officials. We're hearing more of this from our politicians. So it's gone up. So 34% of abortion providers reported severe violence or threats of violence in 2016, and that was up 20% from 2 years previously, right? So in 2015, we know they were targeted in 3 murders, 9 attempted murders, and 94 death threats. So this is a real problem. There's also the argument that it's a woman's right to choose, and this was part of how the Supreme Court made its decision in Roe versus Wade, that a woman has autonomy over her own body and that it's her right to choose when and if she becomes a parent. There's also the pragmatic considerations, right? For people who are pregnant and don't want to be parents, what are we going to do with those children so that they aren't raised in a household where they are unwanted or where their parents are unable or unwilling to care for them? And then, of course, this idea of the separation of church and state, which is one of the founding principles on which our nation was founded, actually. And so if the idea that abortion is a sin is a religious construct, which in many ways it is, then our government should not be involved with enforcing one particular religious ideal over another. There are other religions where abortion is completely accepted and permissible. There's also the safety argument, which is perhaps one of the strongest arguments, that if we make abortion illegal again, that we are going to be faced with desperate people, desperate pregnant people, either attempting to do self-abortions or going to unlicensed, unskilled, unregulated practitioners, and we are going to again see the excess mortality and the deaths of people who are often already mothers, right? And leaving their children parentless oftentimes, which is certainly something we want to avoid. So as often said, Roe versus Wade was not the beginning of women having abortions, right? It was the end of women dying from abortions. They were still getting them when they were illegal. They were just unsafe. And now that we've made them legal, they are safer. So this is always a really interesting argument when we're talking about criminalizing any sort of behavior, and it certainly can apply to criminalization of marijuana, for example. And what are the harms and what are the benefits of making something illegal? And we just need to be thoughtful about that. So wading through the controversy, right, all of these arguments have validity. And so, first of all, I want you to think about, is reducing the abortion rate a goal worth pursuing for our society? Now, there are obviously at least 30% of people in our society who believe, yes, absolutely. A lot of those folks believe that there should be 0 abortions in our country. And so I think when we think about this first question, because from a scientific point of view, I can't know when a person becomes a person, right? No matter how small. I do not know when that magic time comes. And certainly there are a lot of people that find it very offensive and upsetting that people can terminate a pregnancy. Perhaps if we can reduce the rate of abortions, that might be a goal worth pursuing. There are other people who would disagree with me and say a woman should be able to get an abortion anytime, anywhere, anyhow she wants. If she doesn't want to have a baby, she shouldn't have to have a baby. So there's lots of different ways you can go on this. But from here forward, we're going to take as a premise the idea that we might want to work as a country to reduce the abortion rate. If for no other reason, then it's easier to prevent an unwanted pregnancy often than to terminate an already established pregnancy. The risks are a little bit lower, even though the risks of an abortion are low already. So the other thing I want you to start thinking about is, does making abortion illegal accomplish that goal for us? Certainly making something illegal serves as a disincentive, but there are risks attendant to that. And so if that might not be the best way to serve that goal of reducing abortions in this country, what policies might we consider that could decrease the abortion rate and perhaps be safer? So that's what we're going to talk about in the final section for our lecture. I'll look forward to talking with you then.